This is Christopher Sernaque hosting episode 8 of season 3 of the Current Topics in Science podcast. This podcast will address breaking scientific news in light of the origins debate and host interviews with scientists. This podcast is available on the following platforms: iTunes, Stitcher, Google Podcasts, Spotify, and iHeartRadio. Video recordings of the podcast will be uploaded to YouTube. Enjoy the podcast. Today on the Current Topics in Science podcast, we have the honor of hosting Dr. Arthur Chadwick. Dr. Chadwick received his BA in biology from La Sierra College and his PhD in molecular biology from the University of Miami. He received training in both geology and paleontology from the University of California and the University of Oklahoma, and he's worked in the fields of taphonomy and sedimentary geology. He's been a professor of biology, geology, and geophysics at multiple universities, and he was a research associate at the Geoscience Research Institute. He's a paleontology specialist who is the director of the Dinosaur Research Project of the Dinosaur Science Museum and was featured as a taphonomy expert in the acclaimed Is Genesis History documentary. He has done research on a variety of subjects, including systematic analysis of the geologic column in the Colorado Basin. He's a member of 5 different professional scientific societies, and he's earned 11 awards and honors in his scientific career. He also co-directs a taphonomic study at one of the largest dinosaur bone beds in the world. He has conducted geological research at the Grand Canyon, Yellowstone National Parks in Peru, and on fossil whales on the global circulation patterns through time. Dr. Chadwick is the author of numerous scientific papers, as well as the co-author of a science textbook. He's also the co-founder of the Earth History Research Center and currently serves as the director of that center. He currently teaches 5 courses at Southwestern Adventist University, where he's been teaching for nearly 4 decades. Dr. Chadwick is married to his beloved Joy Chadwick, who's a ceramics teacher at that same university. They have 2 adult children, Dan and Barbara, who are both active physicians. He is grateful to God for guiding him and his family. Now, without further ado, good afternoon, Dr. Chadwick. How is your day and how are you doing?
Good afternoon, Chris. It's been a great day so far, and I'm really enjoying spending a little time away from the office. It was my birthday today, so we had a special party this morning and another one at lunch. So it's been an exciting day.
I hope that you're enjoying your birthday, Dr. Chadwick, and it's a pleasure to have you on Current Topics in Science. Now, since this is Current Topics in Science, we're going to quickly look at this week's current topic. Cambridge University Press has just made available for purchase a book by Lee Lyman called Vertebrate Taphonomy. It's a part of the Cambridge Manuals in Archaeology. The description of this book reads, "In recent years, archaeologists and paleontologists have become increasingly interested in how and why vertebrate animal remains become or do not become fossils. Vertebrate taphonomy introduces interested researchers to the wealth of analytical techniques developed by archaeologists and paleontologists to help them understand why prehistoric animal remains do or do not preserve, and why those that preserve appear the way they do." Dr. Chadwick, I'm wondering, in light of this promotion, what do you think about how and why vertebrate animal remains become or do not become fossils?
Well, that's a really broad topic and would take a lot of time to address it adequately, but I can try to approach it. It's clear that when an animal dies, something has to happen very quickly, or its remains will become dispersed and will not remain as to be fossilized. It's difficult today if your dog dies. I had a dog that died a few years ago. I buried him out in my backyard, and he was a large dog, German Shepherd. And a few years later, I tried to find his gravesite. I couldn't even find the bones, even though I knew where I'd buried it. And this is typical of what happens to an organism. Bacteria in the soil and fungi and other kinds of degrading processes take place. And so the remains of an animal are quickly dispersed. In Africa, sometimes one of the things that taphonemists study is what happens to modern animals. There was a herd of wildebeest that went across a river during flood stage a few years back, and about 10,000 of them were killed. And within 2 years, you couldn't find the remains of a wildebeest in that particular area, even though such a huge amount of material was deposited, or was at least deposited at the site. So normally it's serendipitous if an animal's remains are preserved. But if you had a catastrophic process that was burying a lot of things, you would expect to find a lot of things preserved as fossils, because once they're buried and away from the normal biota, they tend to be preserved and eventually fossilized.
Dr. Chadwick, thank you so much for those interesting insights about the fossil record. You know, the fossil record, it's often brought up when discussing origins, with creationists, with evolutionists, with ID advocates, all alike claiming that the fossil record is an accurate reflection of their viewpoint. Dr. Chadwick, in a research paper called Of Dinosaurs and Men, you wrote about how the riverbed of the Paluxy of Central Texas has been a source of extensive discussions between evolutionists and creationists. I was reading this paper, and I came upon this interesting paragraph where you said, "At what cost to truth did we ignore data which were contrary to some pet theory, however interesting or inviting it may have seemed? The cost was indeed great. Creationists might have had the honor of laying aside this misconception 10 years ago with little philosophical expense as a result of their own scientific research. It has now been torn away by individuals, many of whom, unlike Kuban himself, had little regard for the cause of creationism. Creationism does not need the footprints in the Paluxy River for its support." Dr. Chadwick, what's the story behind the Paluxy River, and how can both scientists and laymen alike be more discerning when it comes to scientific research?
The Paluxy River story goes way back into the 1930s and 1940s. There were scientists out exploring in this area in central Texas. And the Paluxy River had long been known to be the source of dinosaur tracks, which were amazing in themselves. Then somewhere along the line, the idea of human tracks with the dinosaur tracks came into the picture, and people began to start to attribute certain features of the riverbed as human tracks and suggest that dinosaurs and humans lived at the same time. Well, that is a belief system for me. I believe that dinosaurs and humans were on the earth at the same time, but I don't want to support it with evidence that's not sound. So we came out in the early 1970s. We drove out to Texas and we explored these tracks. We made casts of what was there, and we discovered that there are elongate tracks that look somewhat humanoid, and there are 3 toed tracks that look very much like dinosaur tracks. And the elongate tracks we discovered had in the front of them, which would be the direction the animal was moving, you could see on several of the tracks that there were 3 toe marks just barely embedded into the mud when the animal was walking. So presumably the animal was not walking up on its foot like this, but it was walking on its ankle like this, which is called plantigrade walking. And so they were probably, the water level was low. If they lived in the water level was low. But for whatever reason, these animals were walking on their wrists, and they left elongate tracks, and they weren't human tracks at all. So we published that, and we were pretty much panned by the creationist community because we were unsettling their argument. But we wanted truth. We didn't care about what the tracks say. We didn't need the tracks to support our position, because our position came basically from the Bible. And we wanted to know what the tracks were, what the tracks said. And if there were human tracks there, that would be very interesting. And we should document it in a scientific fashion and not just spread rumors about it. So that's what we set out to do. And in all our study, we found out that there were a number of tracks that had been carved in the rocks that were both human and dinosaur tracks. So presumably these people back during the Depression would make money any way they could, and some of them carved dinosaur tracks. And we found out we could tell a carved track because the interior structure of the limestone, the internal structure of the limestone was bedded, so you could see lines that would come up to the track and then stop. And that would be a carved track, whereas in a real track, which we also looked at in section, the lines would come and go dip down underneath the track and come up on the other side. So we published that data, and as I said, we were panned by the Creationists, and that's fine. But we could have been responsible for good scholarship. Instead, we were credited with claiming that things that weren't human tracks were human tracks. So that's kind of the blunt end of the story.
And so when we look at that story, are there any lessons that you would say that we can learn from that today and how we would go about doing scientific research now?
I think one thing you can learn is that it has to do with the basis, using science as evidence to support your theory. If you're using science to support your views, I think that's probably wrong-headed, because the views are basically philosophical. Whether you believe in creation or evolution, it's a philosophical position. It's not demanded by science. And I think it's very important for people to recognize that. And it's not necessary to have silver bullets to destroy other people's arguments. Instead, you should build relationships and seek to become a member of the scientific community in good standing by doing good scientific work. And just going out and shouting from the housetops that you have a silver bullet that destroys the evolutionary scenario, that's nonsense, because evolution, as I said, is a philosophical construct, just like creation is, and it's not something that you can destroy. If you have data that suggests somebody else's data is not correctly interpreted, that's fine. Publish it in the scientific literature and establish whatever position you're working on. But don't claim to be doing scientific work if you are not willing to accept the standards of science.
Dr. Chadwick, that was really good advice on how to approach scientific research. And speaking of research, you were a research associate of the Geoscience Research Institute, which recently had a major article published in Adventist Review this February 1st. Raul Esperante, a research scientist from Geoscience, wrote an article called "Why Are Fossils Important for Christians? Learning a Lot from Dead Bones, etc." He concluded the article by saying, "Fossils and the rocks in which they are contained are an excellent platform for discussing origins from a biblical perspective, especially in relation to the design and complexity of ancient life and the worldwide destruction caused by Noah's flood. Many questions regarding fossils, origins, creation, and the flood are still there for us to investigate." Dr. Chadwick, what are some areas of research that you think that creationists need to further investigate in terms of taphonomy and paleontology?
Well, that's a huge question. I was talking to somebody the other day about how I got into this kind of work. It turns out when you're first starting your career, it's very difficult to think of the right questions to ask and how to approach the answer to those questions. But by the time I've reached near the end of my career, I have so many questions that I could supply anybody that wanted projects to work on. I think Dr. Brand and I together are working on 6 or 7 different scientific projects, all of which have some bearing on the relationship of geology and paleontology to the model of origins. So there are a lot of different things that you could pursue. I mean, in our dinosaur research, we're trying to understand how these dinosaurs got to be where they are. We just published a major paper on that last year, and we have started another paper just dealing with the taphonomy of these animals, these amazing animals. So there's just there are a lot of different directions you could go. And of course, all the data we have over 30,000 fossils in our collection. Those fossils tell lots of stories, including predation and scavenging and disease and life processes that you can read out of the bones. So there are a lot of papers coming out right now on our work, and with a special interest in the disease processes and the life processes of these dinosaurs. That's all coming out of the bones themselves.
That's pretty incredible, Dr. Chadwick, and I'm sure that your comments are going to help spur further creationist research. Let's actually take a moment to talk about your own areas of research. On your Is Genesis History bio, it states that you're developing a model for the taphonomy of dinosaur bone beds. Dr. Chadwick, I'm wondering, may you describe your taphonomy dinosaur bone bed model, contrast it with models held by evolutionists, and show why your model perhaps has greater explanatory power?
Just published this model just last year in that major paper, and the model differs from the standard model. A standard explanation for these kinds of bone beds that we're finding is that a dinosaur, it's based on the African model of animal death, that animals were crossing a river when it was at flood stage, and some of them drowned and got swept downstream and caught in a bend in the river. And over time they accumulated and the bones built up and you had a bone bed. That's the standard model that's used by most paleontologists to explain these bone beds. However, we discovered that in our bone bed, the bones were not just randomly distributed, but they were graded with large bones on the bottom and smaller bones on the top, which means they couldn't have accumulated over time. They must have been deposited that way, and thus they must have been deposited in deeper water. And so that can involve something very rapid like a debris flow or some other process that would transport them quickly and bury them quickly rather than accumulation over a number of years. So that's a major difference that we propose. Now, of course, not everybody's going to accept that, but we think that's a valid model and is believable. So that's all based on taphonomy. We're now dealing with some more difficult cases where you have some isolated dinosaurs. We have a couple of triceratops and a duck-billed dinosaur and a raptor and a small dinosaur called Thescelosaurus. And these are all in quarries that are different than the main quarry, which is a bone bed. These are individual skeletons, more or less juxtaposed. So you still have the bones fairly close to their original positions. And so we're having to explain that right now. That's the paper we're working on at the moment.
Dr. Chadwick, it was really fascinating hearing you contrast your ideas about fossils with the ideas held by evolutionists. Evolutionary scientists, like those at the University of Berkeley, state that the fossil record provides snapshots of the past that, when assembled, illustrate a panorama of evolutionary change over the past 4 billion years. The picture may be smudged, but fossil evidence clearly shows that life is old and has changed over time. Now, it sounds like the University of California, Berkeley is making the case that the fossil record is recording evolutionary change. And speaking of recording, when my family went to the Tampa Aquarium, my brother Casey, who's a photographer, he took a picture of a jellyfish, which looks exactly the same as its fossilized ancestors. Dr. Chadwick, can you explain what living fossils are and what their implications are for the evolutionary theory?
There are a number of taxa that have existed all the way through the fossil record, from Cambrian to recent. They're not a super abundant number, but there are a number of taxa. For example, a brachiopod called Lingula, which is a has a phosphate containing shell, phosphatidic brachiopod. It doesn't have a hinge, and we find that in the Cambrian. We also find it in the modern environment. So this is a case of a very long-lived taxon. Well, the taxonomists have come along since this was recognized and have tried to give it a different name so it doesn't look like it's been there the whole time. They do these kinds of things to try to maintain the appearance of a fossil record of some sort. But there are enough taxa. The most recent one are bacteria that have been excavated from deep down in the earth, and they are supposed to be from rocks that are hundreds of millions of years old, and yet they seem to be unchanged from modern taxa. So that again is a bit of a problem. That's just come up in the last couple of weeks. But there are taxa that are called Lazarus taxa that appear early in the fossil record, and then they disappear, and then they appear late in the fossil record, like they were resurrected. But the most common thing you see in the fossil record, the theme of the fossil record, is no change. Things come into the record, they remain in the record for a while, and then they disappear from the record just as they came in. In fact, there's a well-known paleontologist that, I don't know if I mentioned his name, but anyway, he's in Southern California, and he works with mammal fossils. And he did his dissertation, I believe, at Yale, if I'm not mistaken. And he studied 160 lineages of fossil mammals in the Southwest throughout the Cenozoic. So he was tracing these mammals from their first appearance in the fossil record until they disappeared from the fossil record, looking for change. Of course, his goal was to find that change because he was a thoroughgoing evolutionist. In fact, he is in a class of people we call anti-creationists. He hates creationists. They are in his radar. And so he doesn't want to look like a creationist. But nonetheless, of these 160 lineages of fossil mammals that he traced through the Cenozoic, he says 159 showed no change whatsoever from the time they first appeared in the fossil record until they disappeared. The one that changed had slightly smaller, it was an Oreodon, had slightly smaller members when it disappeared than when it first appeared. So the fossil record tended to diminish with position in the strata. But so he talks about the fact that evolution predicts that changes took place during some catastrophic climatic event. But when we look at the fossil record where there are supposed to be catastrophic climatic events, and we look at the mammal fossil record, we don't see any change, which is a striking indication that this scenario does not represent what we see in the fossil record. So he goes back to Stephen Gould's model that the fossil record is mostly stasis, which means there's no change, with occasional punctuations, which is where all the change takes place. The reason Gould came up with that model is because that's what you see in the fossil record. As the scientists found out, when you looked at these fossil mammals, they don't change and they just disappear. So you have stasis, staying the same, and then disappearance. And so that's just, they call that an evolutionary model, but it's a model of creation. It's a model of no change, or very little change.
Dr. Chadwick, thank you so much for that clear answer about living fossils and different changes in the fossil record, or the record of no change, as you said. I'd like to ask you now about one of the most popular fossils, the Trilobite. In an article you have published under the American Scientific Affiliation called The Trilobite, Enigma of Complexity, a Case for Intelligent Design, you wrote, in the absence of evidence for the evolution of complex biochemical and integrated organ systems in the Trilobite, and for any increase in its information content, reliance on Darwinian evolution remains a matter of secular faith. We propose another theory of origins that involves an intelligent designer and special creation. Dr. Chadwick, why do you see the Trilobite and other fossilized creatures as being intelligently designed?
Well, as you mentioned, I have training in both molecular biology and also in paleontology and geology, which gives me a unique position to tackle questions like this. It's very clear if you look inside the cell, and that's what my degree was in the cell molecular biology. If you look inside the cell, you see a marvelous system of roads, of transportation vehicles, and connecting systems and nervous systems, all inside a single cell. Digestive systems, reproductive systems, all of these things are going on inside that little tiny cell. Well, when Darwin first proposed his theory of evolution, the cell was just a bag of fluid. If he had seen the amazing things that we have discovered since then, and I credit the scientific community with having garnered this understanding, which is so astonishing, there's no way he could have proposed the theory of evolution. How can you make a factory? How can you make a motor? And all these kinds of integrated systems that we find inside the cell. And that's just the beginning of complexity. That's at the lowest level. Every system that you have in there needs a system higher up to regulate it. That higher up system needs another system to regulate it. And so you have all these regulatory systems to control the development of the integrated systems that you actually see in the cell. Nobody has come up with an explanation about how that could have happened in a abiotic, non-science, with no scientists there, system with no scientists and no life. How you could ever get the first cell to form is a terrible mystery for those that believe it happened. It doesn't broach solution. It just gets worse. The more you look into it, we're finding more complexities much faster than those paleobiogeochemists are finding explanations for the things they need to make it happen by accident.
Dr. Chadwick, I really enjoyed your answer on how these amazing creatures and how the amazing complexity in the cell it reveals this incredible intelligence. However, not all scientists would agree with you. For instance, Richard Dawkins believes that the fossil record is evidence for evolution, and he believes that ghost lineages have satisfactorily explained fossil patterns in the evolutionary model. Dawkins says, any cladogram can be placed in a temporal framework that agrees with the stratigraphic record if sufficient ghost lineages are invoked. Dr. Chadwick, what are ghost lineages, and is there any evidence for this evolutionary explanation?
Well, I'm not quite sure how he's using ghost lineage. I assume that means that it's there, but you can't see it. It's like the term that Trilobite paleontologists use for the ordovician. They call it cryptogenesis. It's a wonderful word. Crypto means hidden, genesis means origin. Well, if all of your origins and all your changes are hidden or are secret, you really don't have a story to tell. And Richard Dawkins doesn't have a story to tell either. And it's just amazing that he can think, just because I can wave my arms around a little bit, I have an explanation. I want to see an explanation for a single protein, a single functional protein in a world which is not populated by scientists. If you can explain that, then I'll begin to listen to some of the other things you have to say. But until you can show me a single protein with 20 amino acids all in the L form that is put together in the proper sequence to make it do something, you're just arm waving. And that's just one protein. And nobody's even come close to that. Nobody can. There is no scenario that would do that without a scientist. Any experiment on origin of life that's being done now is done in a laboratory or at least by a scientist. So there's always intervention. And usually they use chemicals that they got in pure form from some chemical company. And many of these chemicals have come from living organisms, so they're not even, they can't even get away from that. And their experiments just take us nowhere. I wish they would learn that and go do something more productive with their lives. So they're very smart people.
Dr. Chadwick, that was really incredible. I appreciated how you pointed out that you actually have to have good scientific evidence for a theory. You cannot simply act as though that invoking, sort of seems like rescuing devices or imaginary entities can actually save the theory.
Yeah, I agree with you. I don't think you can save the theory by waving your arms. And I'm speaking about some of the outspoken people that I don't mind confronting on this issue, but many scientists are just neutral on this whole issue. They don't care. They just want to learn what's there. And the more they learn, the less it looks like an accident.
Wow, and speaking of that design, in a film called Is Genesis History, you said, "What we find in the fossil record, and contra to Darwin's hopes, this is the rule, is that a form exists in the fossil record, basically stays unchanged, and it disappears from the fossil record without having been changed. That's got to mean something besides evolution, because we don't ever see changes from this form into this form in the rocks themselves. So it's coming from somewhere else. It's a paradigm that's being imposed on the data rather than the data providing the paradigm." Dr. Chadwick, why is it important to consider your paradigm when practicing science?
That's a really good question because so few scientists do. They aren't even aware of the extent to which their science is driven by paradigms. And I mean, a lot of times what a paradigm does is it fills in all the gaps. And it doesn't mean we have answers. It just means that we can skip over that part. And so the scientists are over here working on some minute aspect of, let's say, cell biology. They're working trying to resolve what's going on. They don't realize that the revelations they're making are inimical to evolutionary theory. And very often you'll find papers, perfectly good papers, written describing scientific research, and then at the end they tack on the obligatory statement about, well, either in molecular biology it's usually about curing cancer, but in other areas it's about how this impacts evolution. And that's nonsense. That's not the paradigm. That's just a whitewash job. And if they really thought about what they were saying, they'd realize that they have gotten into deep water and they're way over their heads. And again, these are very intelligent people. I would never seek to undermine the idea that these scientists are intelligent. They're very intelligent, and yet they are bound by paradigms that ask them to relinquish their freedom to think. And I think creationists have a much better perspective. Creationists who are trained as scientists and who are doing science have a much better perspective on the world around them because they're free to think through all the possibilities. I don't have any restrictions on where I can go with my data. And I think many scientists do.
Dr. Chadwick, thank you so much for that very telling answer. And we've now arrived at our final question. The North American division of the Seventh-day Adventist Christian Church has an article called "Kindness or Set Them Straight? How do we deal with persons who don't believe Genesis is right about creation and the flood?" This article tells a story of how a group of scientists from Loma Linda University, Geoscience Research Institute, and Southwestern Adventist University spent about a decade in research on fossil whales in the coastal plain of Peru. This group of scientists says they ended up finding a Peruvian paleontologist who was searching for more than fossils. Several amazing discoveries happened, and this paleontologist admired the committed faith of this team of Seventh-day Adventist Christian scientists. Dr. Chadwick, Seventh-day Adventist Christians feel a special calling to preach the creation message with the everlasting gospel. Dr. Chadwick, how can a person give their hearts to Christ and accept the faith of Jesus?
The first thing you have to realize is that winning an argument is not going to win a person. And typically what happens is when people lose arguments, they tend to turn away from the person that they're talking to. So I think that should be thrown away. The desire to win an argument should be thrown out the window. We ought to be talking to people about Jesus. And when they see the beauty of his character and what he has done for them, what he is willing to do, that he is Lord of all, they'll recognize more likely that this is a universal issue. It has to do with the whole universe. And if there is no creator, there's no reason to hope that there's a better life. So ultimately, it's the Holy Spirit that brings conviction. It's not humans, it's not arguments. And so our job is to be a spokesperson for Jesus and not to try to destroy people's arguments. I think as long as we're doing that, God can use us to promote him on the earth.
Dr. Chadwick, thank you very much for your time. It was an absolute joy. And to our listeners, thank you very much for taking the time to learn with us on current topics in science, where scientific discoveries are examined in light of the origins issue. Please share and subscribe to the Current Topics in Science podcast. It's available on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Podcasts, Spotify, and iHeartRadio. You can find Dr. Chadwick's biographical information and scientific achievements, a link to the Geoscience Research Institute, a link to the entire Is Genesis History film, which is available for free to watch, and links to the bio, the articles, and the videos of Dr. Chadwick on the Is Genesis History website. Thanks again for listening, and remember, the truth saves.